Welcome to another edition of Curtis Jones Writing. I'm reading every chapter out of every book I've published. I have several books. I'm on the fourth book, which is Love Endures All Things, uh, a love story from a teen marriage to senior citizens. Uh, I'm in chapter 7 this time. And if you remember the story, if you've seen the last story I had written, it was uh, one of the dark times in me and Stephanie's marriage. It was our second fight uh, after about 2 or 3 years being married. Anyway, and I'm ashamed of how I reacted and behaved in that story, but you've got to show the good with the bad, or the bad with the good. This one is entitled Moving On. It's chapter 7. If you get in a hurry and can't wait for me to read and present these, then you could go to my webpage, which is curtis-jones-books.squarespace.com. And there's a link there that will take you to Amazon. They have ebooks. All my books come in ebooks and and paperback, and some of them come in hardback. But I'm working on that and haven't got them all done. Uh, Also, you could go to Facebook and it's Curtis Jones author page on Facebook. It also has links that'll take you there. There's a link to seminars I used to present. They recorded one at the Montgomery Public Library, and you could go to that link and see one of the seminars I used to present before COVID came along. And it teaches people how to write your own book, how to publish them, and so you end up in control of how long it's available. Uh, so let's get started with this one. Anyway, the last one I left her and then I came back and then we made up and we decided we would move to Colorado from California. We lived in the Central Valley in California, over at Modesto. And this time we're going to move to Denver. So let's get started on chapter 7. Stephanie and I began preparation to move our family to Colorado. We settled on Denver as the place we would go. It would take us almost a month to be ready to move. I began selling furniture, yard equipment, and anything else we could carry or could not carry in our car when we moved. We had about 2 weeks' rent paid when we made our decision to move to Colorado. During those 2 weeks, I sold or gave away everything that we could not carry in the car. When we were down to our last few pieces of furniture, we moved to mom and dad's house. We stayed there for the last 2 weeks as we divested ourselves of everything we could not carry. In that last 2 weeks, mom and dad played with the children all of the time. They knew they would miss them. That gave us lots of time to ourselves to talk about our plans and hopes and for the future. We didn't have any solid plans, just a dream of how we would like it to be. Oh, I almost turned 2 pages, sorry. Mom and Dad took movie films of the children and me and Stephanie. They did not know how long it would be until they would see us again. Mom and Dad uh, had two other grandsons that lived in Modesto, California. However, they were taking half, we were taking half of their grandchildren and leaving. Denver is said to be a mile high city, and it felt like our dreams were already a mile high. When I was young, I could not see any obstacles too big to overcome. I believed Stephanie felt the same way I did. She was as excited as I was about the move. Stephanie was a little disturbed that I had to go to mom and dad's house every time, no matter what Stephanie was doing. When I got home or came home from work or came home from school, we would load into the car and go spend a couple of hours at mom's house. Often we would eat supper with them. I think Stephanie saw this as an escape from their activities that I should be engaged in. So the day before we were to leave for Denver, we loaded the trunk of the car with as much as we could put into it. We then began to load the back seat with clothes and other soft materials so that the kids could ride on top with a comfortable place to sit. In the trunk, we had our stereo, television, dishes, and cookware. That night, Stephanie and I barely slept from the excitement that we felt about leaving. When the sun came up, we had breakfast with mom and dad, then loaded the kids in the car. Mom and dad filmed us as we prepared to leave. Everybody then said his and her goodbyes. I was 22 years old and Stephanie was 18 when we left for Colorado. I was young enough that I believed I could drive straight through and arrive 24 hours later. As we pulled out on the highway, we gave each other a good luck kiss. Our hopes were very high. The kids rode atop all of our clothes and the blankets and in the back seat, and it seemed to be very comfortable for them. They could crawl around and lie down and even stretch out, so they didn't not become as tired as Stephanie and I did riding in the front seat. We had an ice chest that sat between us so that we could carry our lunch, some sandwiches that mom had prepared, and drinks. We did this so we didn't have to stop for anything. Everything went very smooth. The car ran like a new car. The kids were happy and did not fuss. Stephanie and I giggled and talked of our plans. It took us several hours to come to the California Nevada border. The trip had taken us into the beautiful Sierra Mountains of California. We also saw very pretty small cities that emphasized their Western heritage. As we entered Nevada, we left the beautiful mountains behind. We were entering the high desert. The kids were not as easily entertained as we drove through the desert. They began to fuss, perhaps because Stephanie and I spoke much less often as we traversed this dull and boring landscape. As we would cross one hill, it would look like the valley we had just came out of. That kind of monotony makes driving difficult. Boredom makes it hard to pay attention to what you're doing. I had an 8-track player under the dash, and by now I had played all of the music that I owned. Stephanie did not want to continue playing the same music over and over. There were no radio stations that I could pick up because I had only an AM radio. It was very early in the afternoon by the time we reached the Nevada Utah border. I was really very tired from having sat so long in one place. We were entering the Great Salt Flats of Utah that ran some distance. My boredom had reached a new peak. We drove about 100 miles into Utah and decided to stop and stretch our legs. We must have spent over an hour at the little park just outside a small town. In just a few minutes after we left the small town, we were in Salt Lake City. We couldn't see a lot of the lake, but there was enough visible that we could tell it was a very big place. As we drove to Salt Lake City, it must have been the rush hour. Traffic was unbelievably difficult, worse than San Francisco in rush hour. It took some time to get through the city. As we were coming out the eastern side of Salt Lake City, the sun was beginning to go down. I drove to the mountains on the eastern side of the city. I made my way to the Utah Colorado border. We were on some kind of plateau by then. The moon was very high, or very bright and high in the night sky. You could see the Rocky Mountains glowing like ghostly sentinels way off in the distance. I drove until I came to Gunnison, Colorado. I needed to fuel up the car. I was still very tired, perhaps more than I was earlier. I didn't want to waste any time. The babies were sleeping, and Stephanie had been trying to nap as we finished the last 100 miles. What lay ahead of me was the start of the Rocky Mountains. They were very steep and tall. I asked the man at the service station how far it was to Denver. He said about 150 miles. I told Stephanie we would drive until we got to Denver. Then I would get us a motel room for the night. She asked if I thought I would be able to make it. I answered in the affirmative. I picked me up a cup of coffee to go as I paid for the gas. We hit the road again. I sipped on the coffee as I began to climb the mountains, where some sections were very steep. About 8 or 10 miles out of town, I finished my coffee. I thought how strange to feel so tired after drinking a cup of coffee. I looked down at my speedometer. I was driving 55 miles an hour. I remember looking up at the road and thinking the moon must be directly overhead. The ground was lit up all around me. My eyes grew heavy and my mind went into neutral. All I can think is that I fell asleep driving through those steep, curvy hills at 55 miles an hour. I don't know what kept me safe in those wee hours of the morning as I sped over the Great Rocky Mountain Divide. I don't know how I managed to stay on the road, avoid the cliffs and the sharp turns and all the wildlife. When I next realized where I was pulling into the outskirts of Denver. The sun was beginning to rise, and I had spent 3 hours driving through the mountains unaware. The love of God is made manifest when such things happen. I didn't tell Stephanie what happened for perhaps a month. She was still quite upset that I did not stop and sleep so that all would be safe. We spent the first night in a motel after we arrived. That morning early, we had breakfast, got a newspaper, and began our search for an apartment. Within 2 or 3 hours, we had found a small mobile home we could afford to rent. We paid our rent and moved in that day. The mobile home was furnished, which was to our advantage. I began searching for work the next morning, bright and early. I searched the newspapers first. Most of the help wanted ads referred you to an employment agency. I talked to several at first. I discovered that it would cost me from $300 to $1,500 to get a job in Denver. That's okay, Lexi. That's okay. I had run a janitorial service in my spare time for the last 3 years, so I resigned myself that I was going to have to pay to get a job. Within 3 days, I was hired to run a cleaning crew at the Cinderella City shopping mall. It was the largest indoor shopping mall in America at that time. It had 3 floors and close to 300 vendors selling goods in that mall. I started work at 10 o'clock at night. I worked until 7 o'clock in the morning. I had more than 30 men sweeping, mopping, and buffing the floors in this huge building. I was given a golf cart to drive through the building, checking on my employees. I enjoyed my job, but Stephanie was upset that she had to spend the night by herself, and I slept most of the day. I felt sorry for her, and I told her I would continue to look for another job. At this job, my employer was taking $10 a week out of my check to pay the employment staffing company. I might have stayed with this job for some time, except for one incident. My employer had made arrangements with the county jail to bring prisoners in to work in place of my regular employees. They told me about this on a Friday evening, saying it would begin on Monday morning. They informed they informed all the employees that that Sunday night would be their last night. I felt good that I did not have to fire those who were working for me. I had become somewhat attached to several of the men. When I went home that Saturday morning, I told Stephanie about the news. She was afraid that the prisoners might harm me in an effort to escape. I had not thought of that until Stephanie suggested the possibility. My crew and I worked the entire weekend without a single problem. I went in early to work Monday afternoon and talked to my bosses. I asked him to return the men I had worked that had worked for me and not to bring prisoners in. I told them that I was concerned about my well-being. They told me they would be nothing to be concerned about. I went back home and I told Stephanie what my boss had said. Stephanie said that did not change the fact that they were men who were incarcerated for being mean. She said I would be left in the mall with no guards, with only these criminals. She said I should consider that I had the keys that unlocked the mall so they could leave if they wished. She said that put me at risk and she did not want to lose me. I told Stephanie that I would give it a try that Monday night. If they seemed to be decent men, I would continue working. I also said that if they scared me, I would quit Monday night. I would inform my boss on Tuesday morning that they would need another supervisor. I went to my office Monday evening at 9:30 and I waited for the county sheriff to bring those men who had qualified for night leave work release. The deputy came in and introduced himself. He said he would bring the prisoners in at 10 o'clock. I asked him if he thought I would be in danger, to which he said, not likely. That did not ease my mind very much. The deputy and his partner brought 30 men and lined them up in the hall by my office. They asked me to come out and told me they would introduce me to their prisoners. I went out and met these men. The deputy told me they were needed back at the jail. I would be in charge of the men until 7 o'clock in the morning. As I met the men, I looked at each more closely and noticed that they had tattoos that spoke to hate and to death. Not a single one of the prisoners seemed to be kind or nice. I think they wanted me to be afraid of them. I was before that even came in, before they even came in. I held the keys to every shop in my office, also to the front and back doors of the mall, hanging from my belt. The sheriff sat there while I assigned duties to each of these prisoners. I issued the supplies they needed for cleaning the floors and the drinking fountains and the restrooms. I suppose I left my imagination run wild with the thought that I could be killed and left there until I was discovered. These men spoke with the foulest words, more than I've heard since I was in the Navy. When they were close to each other after the deputies left, they would slap each other and laugh about it. I knew they had developed a hierarchy in the jail. It seemed to have followed them out here to the work site. When I got off work, I went home and told Stephanie about my night. She immediately wanted me to quit the job, even if I had to leave Denver. By this time, Mom and Dad had decided to move to Stillwell, Oklahoma. Over breakfast, Stephanie and I made the decision that I would quit this job. We would move to Stillwell. I went to my boss's office at 10 o'clock in the morning, telling them I would not be coming back, and asked them to send my check to the general delivery, Stillwell, Oklahoma. We had only 2 days left on our rent, so we were worried about paying for the next month. We devoted that money to renting a place in Stillwell. I stayed up all night and we packed up everything we had and made the car ready for the trip to Oklahoma. It took most of the day to make us ready. I slept like a baby that night and we got up the next morning, folding up our bedding, putting it in the car, and heading to Oklahoma. We left about 6 o'clock that morning. It took about 15 hours to drive to Stillwell. Stephanie and I felt like a great weight had been lifted when I left that job. When we got to Stillwell, we rented a room from the Strawberry Capital Motel. The owner of the motel had a mobile home park next door. When we told them we wanted to rent a place to live, they showed us one of their trailer houses. It was cheaper and bigger than the last one we rented. It was also furnished. We moved in that day. It came with cable TV and utilities. It was located centrally to the business district. We had a phone put in within 2 days. We called Mom and gave them our phone number. Mom called me within a week and said they were moving back to Stillwell themselves. She said they were leaving in the morning. They would be there in 3 days. Dad brought a big trailer. They also brought Henry and Carrie, my little brother and sister. They asked if they could leave them with Stephanie, and they wanted to take me to help drive other equipment back. Stephanie and I had Michael, who was 2 years old, and Brian, who was one, or just about one. Stephanie did not want to babysit the two children plus our children, but she agreed to do so while I went with them to help move them back. Dad had bought a 30-acre place on Workman's Mountain. He took the trailer that we had brought with him and parked it on that place. The next morning, we were to head to California. Dad's pickup was an extended cab pickup. So we three adults, mom, dad, and myself, could ride comfortably. We drove straight through going to California. It took about 36 hours. We got to their house just about dark the next day. We had hamburgers for supper and slept in sleeping bags. We finished loading their truck, their trailer, and their bus. It was a 1948 International School Bus. It was the vehicle I was supposed to drive back to Oklahoma. This bus had bunk beds in it. It contained all of Dad's tools along with his welder and torch. This bus was loaded very heavy. I called Stephanie that day and told her we would head back early the next morning. I said I thought it would take us 3 days to get there because we would sleep each night on the trip back. We brought my little sister Diane. She had been staying with our big sister Betty while mom and dad brought Henry and Carrie the first trip. We had driven about 150 miles south from Modesto when the trouble struck. The trailer dad had was pulling with his truck had a wheel bearing go out, and we had to stop. It took half the day for Dad to go and get the bearing and replace it. I helped him with the repairs. We were once again on our way. We made it to Mojave, California. Mojave is the first town as you enter the Mojave Desert. We spent the night just east of town in the desert. We circled the bus, the car, and the truck and trailer like a wagon train. We gathered wood, built a fire, and Mom cooked our supper there. I was tired, so I slept very well. I slept in the school bus bottom bunk, and Diane slept on the top bunk. Mom and Dad had a bed made in the back end of the pickup. We rose early the next morning. We were driving by the time it got daylight. By 10 o'clock, we were entering Arizona. Things went along very well. We didn't have any more trouble. We camped the next night on the border between Arizona and New Mexico. We knew it would take 2 more days to get home. The next morning, early, we stopped to gas up all three vehicles. I called Stephanie and told her I would be there next day in the evening before I got home. She pleaded with me to please hurry. Babysitting Henry and Carrie were driving her nuts. We took off the next morning and followed closely by each other until we stopped for lunch. We ate hamburgers and got on the road again. This afternoon, I wanted to call Stephanie and to pick up a pop for Diane I for Diane and myself. To do this, I rushed on ahead of everyone. When I pulled into a service station, Diane went to the bathroom. We got our pops, and I called Stephanie. I can only guess that Dad did not see this big yellow bus when he passed the station where me and Diane were. There was a rock wall at the far end of the awning. It may have hidden the bus from his view. I only had about $35 on me. Dad had been paying all the expenses to move his stuff to Oklahoma. I had over half a tank of gas in the bus. Diane and I pulled out close to the highway and waited about half an hour. We never saw Dad and Mom pass. I told her I thought we might have missed them. We started driving east at a slower pace. I hoped they might catch up to us. The next town we came to was the last town in New Mexico. We went to the Highway Patrol office and asked them for help. We asked them we asked that they stop mom and dad if they seen them on the road and tell them where we were. We sat in front of the highway patrol office for 2 hours. I checked with them before we started down the road. They told me they had stopped dad and told him where I was. He was further east from us, so he was ahead of me. He had passed us while we were stopped. I told Diane that we would head that direction, so we started out eastbound watching for mom and dad. We thought they might be stopped on the side of the road waiting for us. I didn't learn until I got home that dad did not stop. He kept driving eastbound, but he slowed his pace to by about 10 miles an hour. We were 20 miles west of him. It would have taken at least 2 hours to catch up. I had to buy gas before we left that town. I had enough gasoline to drive to Amarillo, Texas. During all this time, I tried to drive the speed limit so that I could catch up to Dad. I never did catch him. I was beginning to run out of gas as we came to Amarillo. I told Diane I would not know what I did not know what we were going to do. We would pull into the truck stop and figure out from there what we should do. Diane and I went to the coffee shop at the truck stop. We sat there in the cafe. A hitchhiker from England came up to Diane and I. He said he was going east. He asked us if he could ride with us as far east as we were going. I told him that we weren't going anywhere because I had run out of money and we needed gasoline. He said, I have money for gasoline, but I don't have a vehicle. Why don't I buy your gasoline and you could take me east as far as the gas goes? I told him I thought it was a good idea because Dad or Diane and I would be able to keep traveling. Perhaps we would catch up with Dad. I pulled the bus up to the gas pump. We filled it up. As I was filling up the gas tank, the little Englishman sat in the driver's seat of the old bus. I, uh, I was, as I walked around to the door of the bus, the Englishman was sitting in the driver's seat smiling. It was $30 for the gasoline. He and I walked inside and he paid for it. As we walked back out to the bus, this man asked me if he could drive the bus when we left. I asked him if he knew how to drive and if he had a driver's license. He answered that he did. When we got on the bus, he sat in the driver's seat. He asked how to start the bus. That should have been my first indication that maybe he did not know how to drive. This bus had a button on the floor that you press with your foot to engage the starter. So I thought perhaps he did know how to drive, but had never seen a vehicle this old. I explained to him how to start the bus, and he put it into neutral and started it. He seemed to have a little trouble putting it into first gear. He ground the gears as he tried to engage it. The bus gave a jerk when he let out the clutch. That worried me just a little bit, but I thought once he got on the road, he would not have to shift anymore and we would be okay. I was thankful for that someone was going to help me get out of this mess I found myself in. As we pulled out of the parking lot, he did better with shifting. He had to stop once more before he turned onto the ramp for the freeway. He made his right turn, and as he started moving, he shifted to first gear, then second gear, as we began to speed up. As he was ready to shift to third gear, there was an awful creaking sound that as though metal was scraping against metal. The bus began to slow down. He pulled off onto the shoulder. We were 100 yards from entering the freeway. As the bus stopped, he pulled out the emergency brake and left the motor running. He stood up from the driver's seat. I was standing right behind him. He looked me in the eye. He said, "I'm so sorry." He opened the door of the bus. He stepped down those 3 or 4 steps into the dirt. He turned to his left and started walking down the freeway away from us. I tried to reason what might be the problem with the bus. The motor ran fine, but I could not engage the clutch. So when I tried to shift, all I could do is grind the gears in the transmission. I was afraid I would destroy the transmission if I kept trying. I once had a pickup that lost its clutch in an emergency. I could put the pickup in first gear and turn the starter. The pickup would start and run in first gear without engaging the clutch. I could continue to shift by speeding up or slowing down the engine. So I tried to do this on the bus, but it was loaded so heavy the starter could barely move the bus while it was in first gear. I knew this was not going to work. It was late afternoon after having sat there for 2 or 3 hours thinking about our worsening situation. I told Diane that we were only 2 hours from the Oklahoma border when and then only 400 miles to home. I told her I thought we ought to hitchhike our way home and leave the bus sitting there. Diane said that was okay. She thought it would be fun. So Diane and I started walking eastward until we reached the end of the ramp at the interstate. I started holding up my thumb, trying to catch a ride. We might have stood there for another hour. A man stopped. Let me turn the page. A man stopped that was driving a new Chrysler New Yorker. It looked like a new car to me. He was dressed in expensive clothes. I sat in the front seat and Diane sat in the back, so we started driving. By this time, I didn't have a penny to my name. As we drove along, I told him the story of how we came to be hitchhiking on the Interstate 40, how the bus had just broken down. He said he was going to have to stop and get some gasoline himself. By this time, we were just about at the border of Oklahoma. I asked him if he could buy me a pack of cigarettes, which upset him terribly. He told me we would have to catch another ride because he wasn't sure that Diane was even my sister. She looked about 12 years old. He walked down the We walked down the entrance ramp to the Interstate 40 again. Diane and I stood there with our thumbs held out for about 5 minutes. A semi truck stopped to give us a ride. We crawled up into the cab of that truck. He said he was going to Little Rock. We told him we were going to Sallisaw, Oklahoma. He knew exactly where that was. We rode with this truck driver for 6 or 7 hours. He drove until 3 in the morning when he let us off at Sallisaw. He asked if we would just ride with him to Little Rock and back. He said he would uh, drive us up to Stillwell, where we were going. I told him, thank you for the ride, but I thought we would make it by 4 in the morning if we had any luck. Diane and I walked about half a mile to a truck stop on the east end of Sallisaw. There was a young kid just coming out of the truck stop. We flagged him down and asked for a ride to Stillwell. He told us he would be very happy to drive us all the way to Stillwell. We got in his car and headed north out of Sallisaw. I knew we would be home in an hour. This kid was probably 17. He said he worked at the truck stop washing dishes. He had just got off work and he was headed home. That was about 1:30 in the morning. Diane and I had Diane and I got in his car and headed north. He had driven about halfway to Stillwell when he stopped his car. He said he was going to turn off the road here. I reminded him that he told us he was going to drive us to Stillwell. He simply said he changed his mind. Now it is about 2:30 in the morning. Diane and I started walking up this very dark highway. It was difficult to see the roadway, but I followed the white line on the right side of the road. We made our way to the top of the hill about a half a mile. There was a street light against the highway that pointed at that point, I'm sorry, at that point, and a house 100 yards off the road. We stopped under the light and waited for a car to come by. We may have stood there 15 minutes when the first car came. Holding out our hopes for a ride, the car didn't even slow down. Diane and I stood out there for a good 2 hours hoping for a ride. We had no luck at all. When I noticed the barn about 50 yards off the road, it had a fence around this side of the barn. There were 2 or 3 calves in that area. I watched the calves acting agitated. I noticed to my left a light colored beast moving. My attention then shifted from those calves to the new creature I was looking at. It walked like a cat. I then noticed it had a long tail that curved up at the end. My heart began to race. I realized I was looking at a mountain lion. I looked over at Diane. She was watching down the road looking for headlights. I watched this lion as he jumped over the fence in a single bound. It took one of the calves by the throat. These calves were perhaps a week old, so they were not very big. They didn't make a lot of noise as they bellowed. As the cat took one by the throat, the other ran to the far end of the pen. I felt a little better knowing that this animal had already caught his dinner. It jumped over the fence toward me, or in my direction, with the calf in its mouth. That gave me a terrible fright. I decided we ought to leave this place. I looked at Diane to see that she had not seen anything yet. I was afraid if I told her what I had seen, she would become scared, starting to run, and the animal would chase us. I called to Diane and I said, "Let's walk down this way," which was away from the light and towards Stillwell. She and I started walking north along this road. I watched the big cat out of the corner of my eye. It no longer had the calf in its mouth. It walked along that fence the same direction we did. I became more alarmed because I knew mountain lions see children as prey animals. I wasn't so much afraid for me, I was as I was for my little sister. I told her, "Let's turn around and walk back to the light." She complied with my request. I noticed that the big cat also turned and walked the same direction we did. I was surprised it didn't run away for fear of humans. Fear was just about to overcome me when I heard the unmistakable sound of a diesel truck coming up the highway. I looked over at the big cat. It was standing over a dead calf. So Diane, so with Diane standing there under the street light and me next to her, I stepped out in front of this semi truck and began to wave my arms. I closed my eyes as I heard the tires on that truck begin to squeal. I wasn't sure if I would survive, but I knew that he would have to take me and my little sister with him, one way or another. The truck was able to stop 10 or 15 feet before it came to me. I was so relieved to see that. I ran up and opened the door and on the passenger side, and I told him what I had just seen. He looked over that direction to see what he could see. The big cat was no longer there. You could barely see the calf laying on by the fence. I don't think he even saw the calf. I helped Diane up inside the truck. I crawled in right behind her. The driver told me he didn't believe anything I had said. However, he would give us a ride to Stillwell, nonetheless. He let us off at the north end of town. We only had 100 yards to walk to get to my house. We walked to the house. I knocked on the door. Stephanie came and opened the door for us. She told me Mom and Dad had just arrived there at 2 in the morning that same night. I think how stubborn he must have been not to drive back and pick us up. This his trip took almost all his trip took almost as long as mine. Mom and Dad got up because of the commotion when Diane and I got home. I told them what had happened, that the bus was still in Amarillo, Texas. Dad told me we would have to go back and repair it and bring it to Stillwell. Stephanie told him that going I was going to sleep that day because I was exhausted, and we would start the trip tomorrow morning. Another one of the events that happened to me. I tell you, my life was full of all kinds of strange things. The next presentation will be family grows, and that's kind of a sad story too. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but I want you to know